Some of the parts needed to be cleaned up a little bit before I could start painting them. They had a couple of sprues attached to them which needed to be cut off and then smoothed out with the rest of the part, and also a couple of mold lines were visible and a bit of flash was shown here and there, so a bit of scraping, a bit of sanding, and all the parts were nice and ready for paint. Now I'm also going to be adding a lot of carbon fiber, or a lot, I'm just going to be adding a couple carbon fiber trim pieces to the interior, mainly the dashboard, the door panel, and also a bit on the center console and steering wheel. So prior to painting I always like to make some templates with a bit of masking tape and just some permanent marker, so I don't have to do that after the fact, and I can just easily cut those out and put them on the painted surfaces. Some additional smaller detail pieces from photo etch needed to be glued onto the dashboard too. I always like to do this prior to painting, as it's just a lot cleaner, and I can clean up my mess if I do so potentially. All the other parts were then sanded with a 400 grit prior to priming. As most of the parts are made out of resin and some smaller pieces out of metal, I like to use a primer that is suitable for both, and that in this case is a liquid surface primer from Tamiya. I'm just using it pretty much straight out of the bottle, shake it up a little bit, maybe add a little bit of lacquer thinners, and then just apply it in a couple light coats. So the cars that I've seen painted in the same color that I've painted mine came with a white and black interior. I really like that look. I didn't decide to go for a full bright white, but just tone it down a little bit and went with a racing white. That is a little bit more of a creamy white and not just as bright white as in your face as a regular white, but just has a bit of a tone down, which I really like. So I decided to paint the bottom half of the dashboard in this white, some insert panels on the door panels too, and the main seats as well, of course. With the interior going to be painted in a two-tone, some parts were painted white first and other parts were painted black first, as some of those areas were easier to mask off than the other. So the dashboard was painted white first, as that lower half was easy to paint in white and then mask off for the black. In this case, the seat backs are painted black first, as it's easier to mask these off. With all the masking now completed on all the parts that need to be painted in two tones, I went over some parts with a gray primer again. As you can see on the seats, there was a bit of overspray from the black onto the rest of the seat, and if you just went over it with the white, that would stain a little bit and not show up really nice. So I decided just to even it out again with a bit of primer and then applied a couple light coats of the white. And with the seats now completed, I moved on to the dashboard. That lower section was painted white and masked off, so I can now paint that top half in black. The black paint that was used was specifically marked off by Tamiya as being a flat black, and therefore after applying it and curing, it dries up nice and flat. If the paint is not specifically mentioned to be either a flat or a semi-gloss, with these Tamiya lacquer paints that means that they are actually a gloss. The white wasn't marked off specifically, so of course that dried up pretty glossy, and therefore I needed to seal it up all with a nice flat clear in order for it to match and give a nice leather look. After the paint had cured, I moved on to the detailed parts and also detailed painting on some of these smaller areas. First, I applied a couple of the photo etch pieces for the speaker grills. These needed to be painted in a different color, so it was easier just to apply them after the fact that all the parts have been painted, and then just brush on some of the color by hand. The dashboard was of course already painted in the black and white color scheme, but some of these smaller detail parts it was easier just to paint them with a brush instead of masking them up. I just took out a small brush and painted them with some flat black paint. Some other small details were added too, like on this radio panel there were some small silver trim pieces which needed to be applied as well. This was a bit of a tedious job, but luckily the parts lent themselves really well to adding this small detail as the main shape was already in there. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'm going to be adding some carbon fiber to the interior trim, starting it off with the steering wheel, then of course moving on to some of the door panels and the dashboard too. So just like on that small radio piece, there are some silver trim pieces that need to be applied around the vents on the dashboard as well. This was done with a even smaller brush from Tamiya and some silver paints, of course. With the silver pieces now added, I also added a small amount of gloss black and could then move on to adding the carpet. Now normally I'd use some clear paints or even some color paints in order to act as a glue for the flocking material to stick to it, but I've wanted to try this method for a long time. I used it way back when I started modeling, but didn't really like it somehow, and I figured I'd give it another try, as the clear paints isn't really the ultimate solution for me, as most of it doesn't really want to stick as the paint dries super quick. Now this should be a little bit longer to cure, but overall I hope the finish of this looks a bit better. If you have any suggestions on what you use to stick your flocking to the floor pans, let me know down in the comments below. Some decals were added to that radio bezel, even to the iDrive system, and of course on the dashboard and seats as well. After finalizing all the detailed painting and decal application, I could move on to a couple more photo etch pieces for the main panel assembly, and then start on the final assembly of the other interior parts. In this kit there are a couple of parts included to add details like seatbelts, but those parts are made out of photo etch, including the seatbelt material itself. Now I did decide to use the buckles from the kit, but the seatbelt material was replaced with ones from scale production. After gluing on the steering wheel to the main dashboard, that assembly is finished, and I could finalize the interior by gluing on the door panels. Now I'm holding the dashboard in place as I'm not gluing it in permanently yet, as with some of these kits it requires for the dashboard to be mounted into the body, and it doesn't fit if it's already mounted to the interior, so I'm just going to hold that in there loosely for now, and once I do the final assembly I'll probably glue it in then.